We have an active shooter.
Let's go ahead and declare this a mass casualty.
Welcome to Active Shooter, a podcast that covers the whys, the hows, and the aftermath of active shooter and mass casualty events.
They have an active shooter in the building. A second call says they are being attacked.
I've been shot. 16910 means we got shots fired at 4:15 at Route 291. Sounded like an automatic firearm.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
Thank you for listening.
You are listening to Active Shooter, a podcast that may contain adult themes, explicit language, and graphic depictions of violence. Portions of this show may be traumatic for those under 18. Listener discretion is advised.
Now to that deadly shooting at Pearl Harbor. Just days before the 78th anniversary of the attack there, a sailor opening fire, killing 2 civilian workers and wounding a third before turning the gun on himself. Kaylee Hartung is on the scene with the very latest. Good morning, Kaylee.
Good morning, Michael. We're just outside the historic base at Pearl Harbor. These gates now reopened were on lockdown yesterday, as in broad daylight, an active duty U.S. sailor opened fire in a submarine maintenance area, striking 3 Department of Defense employees.
The Active Podcast has covered shootings ranging from those that were absolutely preventable to those that no one ever saw coming, and nearly everything in between. The shooting at the Pearl Harbor-Hickam Joint Base may truly be the most unpredictable shooting that has ever been shared on this podcast. The shooter had full access to an arsenal of weapons, thanks to his position with the U.S. Navy, yet no true issues with any one individual he encountered in his day-to-day life and service. There were absolutely no reported mental health issues, and no criminal record whatsoever. There is no known motive, and speculation of such is flimsy at best. There was no known target, and the shooting seemed both well thought out and entirely spur of the moment, as if the shooter knew the when, where, and how of it all. It's the why in this case that makes today's case so utterly baffling. Active Shooter, the podcast, is a High Five Holly production, and I'm your host, JT. If you've listened to our prior episodes, you know that the Active Shooter podcast team has taken the No Notoriety Pledge, and we will not be sharing the real name of the shooters that we cover. We will be giving the shooters a pseudonym, and refer to them by that name throughout the episode. This will help in clearing up any confusion in the story, while remaining true to our pledge in not naming the shooter by their actual name. We will refer to today's shooter as Chris. The Joint Base Pearl Harbor-Hickam is located on the Hawaiian island Oahu, and it is the larger of 2 Navy regional Hawaii installations. The base hosts over 175 tenant commands, 6 fixed-wing aviation squadrons, and over 24 submarines and ships. The island is also home to a substantial number of nuclear-powered fast-attack submarines, and is one of 4 United States Navy submarine home ports in the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. Air Force and Navy combined total population of 65,000 includes active duty personnel and their family, as well as civilian employees, and a large percentage of that number is based in Hawaii. Wednesday, December 4th, 2019 was a cloudy yet warm day only 3 days before the 78th anniversary of the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It is not clear whether the motive for the shooting attack was in any way related or motivated by the attack that led to the United States' entry into World War II. Though the overall destruction was not the same, the intention to inflict terroristic violence and fear onto innocent and unsuspecting people is nothing short of deplorable. At approximately 2:04 p.m., 22-year-old Chris reported for duty at the Pearl Harbor Hickam base, where he was assigned to the USS Columbia. As he approached the on-duty sailor, Chris relieved his fellow soldier with the words, quote, "I am ready to relieve you," to which he received the reply, quote, "I am ready to be relieved." These are the standard phrases used by sailors when they take over duty from one another. The sailor that Chris relieved later reported that Chris displayed no anger, aggression, or any other indications that he was minutes away from morphing into a full-fledged monster. As he began his shift, Chris took possession of an M4 rifle with 90 rounds of ammunition and an M9 pistol with 45 rounds of ammunition, making the requisite logbook entries. Just before he should have been making the first patrol round of his shift, Chris told the petty officer of the deck, quote, "I'll be back," before walking off without another word. It would be the very last words he would speak aloud to another human being, before murdering 2, injuring 1, and then taking his own life. Chris carefully walked around Dry Dock 2, from left to right, the dry docks being where the ships and vessels are maintained. At almost the same moment that Chris strode towards the dry docks, 3 Pearl Harbor Navy Shipyard, or PHNSY, civilian employees departed their workstations, located inside a trailer that was situated between Dry Docks 2 and 3, and they proceeded walking along the right side of Dry Dock 2. The time was about 2:30 p.m. when Chris rounded his right side of Dry Dock 2 and came upon the 3 civilian employees from behind. He raised the M4 rifle, chambered around, and fired at the 3 employees, who were utterly at Chris's mercy. He had them wholly unaware, and they sadly didn't even have a chance to react. Within mere moments, all 3 were on the ground, hardly 20 feet in front of Chris.
I heard a bunch of shots going off in the area, and we were told by my chief to hunker down.
Mercifully, the next shot he fired with the M9 pistol was turned on himself, and not on those 3 employees.
I can also report that the shooter, who has tentatively been identified as an active duty sailor assigned to USS Columbia, is also deceased by an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound.
You see, while tragically 2 of the 3 civilians were pronounced dead at the scene, the 3rd was rushed to the hospital and eventually released. Had Chris continued shooting, the outcome may have been even more catastrophic. The entire shooting lasted only seconds, although those seconds likely still felt like an eternity, particularly for the lone eyewitness. The petty officer that Chris told he would be right back to actually had the achingly hideous luck of having to watch the entire scene unfold before his very eyes, powerless to stop the impending doom. Within a minute of the beginning of the shooting, the Navy security forces arrived, and within 6 minutes, the Federal Fire Department Emergency Medical Services were on the scene. "32-year-old Vincent Jerome Capoy, also known as Vince, was born on February 9th, 1989. He attended the Kamaile Elementary School in Waianae, Hawaii, before being accepted into Kamehameha Schools, where he graduated in 2007. He graduated from the University of San Francisco in 2011 with a bachelor's degree that focused on entrepreneurship. After graduating, Vince returned to Oahu and got a job working for Enterprise Rent-A-Car. A magnanimous, good-hearted person, Vince was overjoyed when he married the love of his life, Tara, in April 2019. The couple hadn't even reached their first wedding anniversary before he was irrationally ripped from the woman, family, and friends that held him so dear. Vince was the definition of a hard worker, and it wasn't long before he rose to the position of Metals Inspector Apprentice at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, and in his spare time, Vince became licensed in insurance sales. Never one to rest on his laurels, He'd even started his own podcast about building wealth called Taking Control of Your Finances and Time with Vincent Capoy Jr. Vince was extremely popular and had countless close friends that he enjoyed just living life with. He was laid back and loved to have a good time. A GoFundMe was established in Vince's honor and quickly raised just under $13,000. Vince is survived by his wife, father, mother, brother, and 2 sisters who will deeply mourn the loss of such a giving soul. Roldan Agustin was born on October 6, 1970, in Loag City, Ilocos Norte, in the Philippines, though he actually grew up in Waipahu, Hawaii, and attended Waipahu High School. Roldan enlisted with the Navy in 1988, and thus began a long and decorated career with the United States military. Sometime between 1995 and 96, he enlisted in the Hawaii Army National Guard as a 68J aircraft armament and missile system repairer. He served with the Aviation Intermediate Maintenance 193rd Aviation, and in 2000 he converted to a 67T, which is now known as a 15T UH-60 Blackhawk aircraft mechanic. Roldan later served with Company D, 1st Battalion, 207th Aviation as a UH-60 helicopter technical inspector. He was deployed to Afghanistan in 2005 and again in 2011 to Kuwait. In July 2014, Roldan retired from the Army National Guard. At the time of the shooting, he was working as a shop planner for the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard in the Non-Destructive Testing Division. Family and friends describe him as a forthright, genuinely considerate man. Roldan spent as much time as possible with his family, especially his nieces who adored their uncle. He kept busy with a multitude of hobbies, including tinkering with cars. Roldan was taken from this world much too soon. He was only 49 years old when he was murdered, despite his many years and acts of service. The USS Columbia, which is the vessel Chris was assigned to, was receiving maintenance at Dry Dock 2 when the shooting occurred. The Fast Attack submarine is a Los Angeles-class nuclear-powered submarine built at Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, and commissioned in 1995. The submarine was home-ported in Pearl Harbor as one of the 8 submarines in Squadron 7. The crew for the USS Columbia is made up of approximately 150 officers and enlisted personnel. In 2018, the vessel returned from a Western Pacific deployment, which was its 10th overall deployment and the second within 3 years. It entered Dry Dock 2 at the Pearl Harbor Navy Shipyard in October of 2018 to receive much-needed major maintenance, which was scheduled for completion in January of 2021. Chris was born on April 4, 1997, at Oakwood Hospital in Dearborn, Michigan. When he was 3, Chris was mainly raised by his mother. It's unclear whether his father passed away or simply disappeared from his family's lives. The information was redacted from the police report collected while researching this case. Chris was raised with 2 older brothers and a younger sister and was considered a protective and doting brother. His formative years weren't stable, and Chris attended 3 high schools in 4 years, including Douglas MacArthur High School in San Antonio, Texas, I School of Louisville, Texas, and Woburn Memorial High School in Woburn, Massachusetts, which is where he graduated in 2015. Despite struggling academically, Chris was an exceptional hockey player and even went on to play for a hockey association in Casper, Wyoming. The association developed young players, helping them to prepare for college and, in some cases, professional hockey. Chris was passionate about playing, but it didn't stick, and he decided to return to San Antonio, where he enrolled at the local community college. There, Chris continued to grapple with the learning part of school, so in November of 2017, he chose to enlist in the United States Navy. Despite his mother's report that Chris suffered numerous concussions while playing hockey, none ever resulted in the loss of consciousness. Furthermore, when he enlisted, Chris had no documented physical or mental conditions. He completed the Armed Service Vocational Aptitude Battery and entered into military service at the Military Entrance Processing Station in San Antonio, where he initially applied to be a steelworker. On December 4th, 2017, Chris volunteered for submarine duty as a machinist mate. However, before he could report for any duty, there was a requisite medical screening he needed to undergo. During this screening, Chris reported no pre-existing mental health issues, depression, or suicidal ideology, so he was cleared, and on December 11th, he reported for recruit training at Naval Station Great Lakes in Great Lakes, Illinois. Chris graduated from training on February 3, 2018, and was immediately transferred to the Naval Submarine School in Groton, Connecticut. Later that year, on June 12th, Chris graduated from Machinist Mate Auxiliary A School. His records didn't provide a class ranking at the time of graduation, so we are unable to report that. From there, Chris received an assignment to the fast attack submarine USS Columbia, which had its home port located in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. He reported to the base on June 28, 2018, as a machinist mate auxiliary firearm recruit in the Auxiliary Division. Again, before reporting for this duty, Chris continued to claim, and had, no documented mental health counseling or suicidal behaviors. Screenings for overseas and sea duty were not required for duty stateside in Hawaii. There was a physical and submarine duty screening performed, but the results were normal. There were certainly no obvious or easy-to-identify red flags. Chris lived on Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam in the barracks, specifically the Paquette Hall, Building 654, Room 361. After about 6 months of living on board, he qualified for barge security watch, and 2 armed watch stations including the topside roving patrol and petty officer of the deck. Before long, however, Chris began to fall behind, hardly managing to carry on the qualifications he needed to maintain for those stations. The chain of command took swift administrative action to address Chris's issues, which included exceeding the qualification deadline of 12 months, repeated tardiness, and overall deficient performance. As such, on 10 separate occasions, Chris received written counseling or extra-military instructions. In June of 2019, Chris was required to attend after-work study periods as a result of his inadequate qualifications. He failed to complete the requirements, which meant that Chris was not qualified in submarine warfare or to stand technical watches. He was mainly assigned to non-technical watches on the pier, which consisted of constantly roving the area around the submarine and berthing barge, which is located near the dry dock. On September 11, 2019, Chris received a counseling chit for sitting while on his tour as the barge security watch. For reference, a chit is any piece of paper that could include a pass, a form, and even currency. According to the Navy History Museum, quote, the word chit was carried over from the days of Hindu traders when they used slips of paper, chitti, for money. The higher-ups required that the shooter perform a, quote, watch standing upgrade, which is a remedial process that included reviewing watch standing principles, conducting interviews, and completing a barge security watch qualification card. Chris went on temporary duty to the fast attack submarine USS Chicago for 10 days, starting on November 4, 2019. While there, he completed the remaining practical evolution factors needed to earn the helmsman qualification, and he eventually went on to earn his submarine warfare pin. During his time on the USS Chicago, Chris kept to himself and rarely spent time with anyone. He reportedly exhibited very little knowledge and gave an overall I don't give a damn attitude. Before his temporary stay on the USS Chicago was finished, the boat's chief dismissed Chris and allowed him to return to the USS Columbia. It was alleged that the boat chief felt Chris needed to return to his boat so he could study and master his qualifications. The USS Columbia held a disciplinary review board on November 21, 2019, where Chris's negligence with his qualifications and consistent tardiness was addressed. During the meeting, when his derelict performance was being discussed, Chris began to cry in front of the review board, something Chris frequently did when he was disciplined. The Chief Petty Officer's recommendation from the Disciplinary Review Board was to forward Chris's case to an executive officer inquiry. On November 26, 2019, Chris was notified that he failed to pass the Naval Advancement Exam and would not be promoted. About a week later, on December 3rd, the executive officer conducted the official inquiry into the charge against Chris for a violation of Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The specification read that Chris was aware of his duties aboard the USS Columbia, yet, on 7 separate occasions he was, quote, derelict in the performance of those duties in that he was shown a pattern of misconduct, which has resulted in the member being late to ship's muster times, delinquent study muster times, watch relief times, and duty section muster times. As he was being questioned, Chris had a meltdown and began gushing that he really wanted to be in the Navy. The result of the inquiry was that Chris was issued a formal written counseling, or page 13, which stated in part, quote, if I am late to work again, I will be held accountable at CO's NJP. The CO NJP stands for Commanding Officer's Non-Judicial Punishment. When the ship's administrative personnel presented Chris with the page 13, he flatly stated that he would not sign it, at least not right then, because he had previously been told that he would have until the end of the week to do so. Though the executive officer meant to clarify to Chris that he was required to sign the page 13 the following day, he didn't actually do so, and as such, the page 13 was not signed or delivered before the shooting. Chris had no previous history of mental health treatment before reporting to the USS Columbia, yet on March 9th, 2019, he took himself to the Tripler Army Medical Center's emergency room, where he reported experiencing trouble focusing at a traffic court hearing earlier that day. He staunchly denied suicidal or homicidal ideations, but as a precaution, a Tripler Police Department officer was dispatched to the hospital to conduct a contraband search. Chris's division chief went to the emergency room, where the medical staff informed him that Chris was no harm to himself or others. However, medical staff did note that Chris had a possible attention deficit disorder, and he was referred to the Naval Submarine Support Command Embedded Mental Health Program Clinic in Pearl Harbor to undergo further evaluation and treatment. Despite the referral, the Embedded Mental Health Program Clinic cannot receive outpatient referrals through the electronic medical record system, which is how Chris's referral was sent over. There were no other means of notification or referral. In addition, the referral was not ever copied to the division chief or any other USS Columbia Medical Department representative. Chris merely told his division chief that he was having some trouble sleeping and had been concerned over a family member's health, though the family member Chris was referencing is unknown as it was redacted from the police report. Over the next 3 months, Chris visited the Embedded Mental Health Program Clinic 8 times, each visit being voluntary. On September 23, 2019, Chris was assessed by a psychologist who did not diagnose Chris with a mental health disorder. He gave Chris a diagnostic impression of having a, quote, phase of life problem and an, quote, unspecified problem related to unspecified psychological circumstances. Chris met with the psychologist on 5 different occasions, when on October 22nd, both the doctor and Chris agreed that their sessions would end due to all goals being reached. Chris had never expressed threats of violence or thoughts of harming others or himself, and was overall a model patient by all accounts. Because he wasn't diagnosed with any type of mental health disorder, Chris was allowed to continue reporting for submarine duty without any limitations. The psychologist recommended that Chris continue to attend individual therapy, specifically focusing on his familial issues and learning coping mechanisms. Could disciplinary measures have been the motive for the shooting? Was simply being held accountable enough to explode the ticking time bomb that was this shooter? We may never know for sure, because this shooter once again evaded facing the full consequences of his actions. We all have the unique ability to help prevent such a catastrophic event from happening, if we keep our eyes and ears open, and never hesitate to report when something or someone just doesn't seem right. With the delicate balance of mental health reform, education, active shooter training, and common sense gun laws, we may one day realize the dream that there will be no more active shootings. We pray that love will prevail over hate.
Too many have died. We should say to ourselves, not one more.
In the meantime, we urge our listeners to stay aware of your surroundings and keep in touch with your loved ones. If you see something, say something. You never know how many lives you'll be saving. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Active Shooter, the podcast. Remember, if you see something, say something. There's no telling how many lives you may be saving. A big thank you to Darren Curtis, who composed some of the songs on our show. You can find him online at www.darrencurtismusic.com. Make sure to check us out on social media. You can find us on Facebook at Active Shooter, the podcast, and on Twitter at Podcast Active. Thank you, and be safe.